Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Heather Blumenthal, the Executive Director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Centre, and it really is wonderful to welcome an international audience to our webinar tonight. Early in March, Dr. Björn Krondorfer had spoken at our sister centre in Johannesburg, but unfortunately Durban and ourselves weren't able to host him due to the lockdown. However, Björn is with us tonight with three panelists who all contributed to the recently published book, The Holocaust and Masculinities, Critical Inquiries into the Presence and Absence of Men. Dr. Björn Krondorfer is the director of the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University, an endowed professor of religious studies in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies. His field of expertise is religion, gender and culture, and post-Holocaust and reconciliation studies. He is the author of numerous publications, including his latest book, Unsettling Empathy, Working with Groups in Conflict, amongst others. As the director of the Martin Springer Institute, he has organized several international academic symposia and has mentored the creation of several exhibits, the latest being Through the Eyes of Youth, Life and Death in the Bedzin Ghetto, which was supposed to have been exhibited at the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Centre next month. Dr. Lisa Pine is Associate Professor of History at the London South Bank University and is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Her main research interests are the social history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. She's the author of numerous publications, including Nazi Family Policy, 1933 to 1945, Hitler's National Community, Social and Culture in Nazi Germany, Debating Genocide, and many more. She is also the editor of Life and Times in Nazi Germany and The Family in Modern Germany. Dr. Monika Rice is an assistant professor and the director of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Gratz College, Pennsylvania. She received her PhD from Brandeis University and is the author of What? Still Alive? Jewish Survivors in Poland and Israel, Remember Homecoming. Monika has also written chapters in edited volumes and articles exploring post-war identities of Polish Jews and Polish-Jewish relations. And last but not least, Dr. Robert Sommer is a Berlin historian and scholar in cultural studies and received his PhD from Humboldt University of Berlin in Germany. His research focuses on sexuality and sexual exploitation in Nazi concentration camps, as well as prostitution politics in the Third Reich. Robert is the author of several books on the camp brothels. He is also research associate at Ravensbrück and Flossenburg concentration camp memorial sites, and for numerous documentaries such as the BBC's Auschwitz, The Nazis and the Final Solution. Robert also teaches at various universities in the States. Many of you may remember the beautiful and poignant photographic exhibition, Objects from the Concentration Camps at Ravensbrück and Sachsenhausen, that we hosted at the Centre in December and January of this year. Robert, along with photographer Richard Wiesel, curated the exhibition. So before we start, if we can have a little bit of housekeeping, all attendees, you will be on mute while the panel discussion is on. If for any reason your picture starts to buffer, switch off your camera. You won't need it for the duration of the panel discussion. And if you have any questions, at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A button. Click on the button, you can write your questions down, and at the end of the session, Dimitri will ask the panelists to answer your questions. A special word of gratitude to Björn, who will be our moderator for tonight, as well as for inviting our illustrious panelists. Over to you, Björn. I think Björn has just gone to change his Wi-Fi position. So, there we have Björn. Hi, Björn. Welcome back. And we are handing it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. And thank you to the whole staff at the Holocaust and Genocide Center in Cape Town for making this possible. It is really wonderful that we have a chance to talk a little bit about gender and the Holocaust, and particularly masculinities and the Holocaust today with three great co-panelists. Before we start, I just want to mention my co-editor Ovidio Krianga, who worked with me on this book. He might even be listening in today. And a short shout out to some of my former students who I know might be listening, and some of the teachers in Arizona who are also listening, and some friends. So it's wonderful that you also joined us with the panel that is organized by Cape Town. I will speak a little bit about why this book is important, because we certainly have gotten often questions for those who study and research on the Holocaust. Why would gender matter? I mean, we know about the Holocaust. We know the Holocaust targeted primarily European Jews, and it didn't matter whether you were a man, a woman, a child. You were all targeted for death. So why does it matter that we look at gender? That question has been raised really since the 1980s, mostly by feminist historians and women historians who said, like, if we do not pay attention to women's experiences, we don't understand fully what the Holocaust meant to the Jewish communities in Europe. And if we don't train our eye also on perpetrator societies and look at women who were either perpetrators or bystanders or enablers or in some way or the other involved, we also don't understand fully the dynamics that happen in genocidal situations and genocidal assaults. So the question of gender really has been in the scholarship and in public debate since the 1980s. But not much attention has been paid to looking at men as a gendered category. Rather, we kind of have assumed that men don't need to be explained because they are also prevalent in the history to begin with, and they're so prevalent in the memoirs that have been published in the past. That has changed, by the way, in the last decades. And they have been so prevalent in the profession, among historians, that men don't, because their presence is so strong, they don't really need to be interrogated in any particular way. We just assume that we know who they are and what they thought and what they did and why they did so, without asking, is there anything specific about the male experience that needs to be looked at a little more carefully? And that is really what this book is about. There has been some scholarship in the past, here and there, on masculinity or man, but probably not in the sustained way as we would like it to be. So the book that just came out 2 months ago is an attempt to kind of restart that program, restart that question. It involves 12 select chapters by 12 different scholars. Obviously, there's so much more to say than one book can say, but at least it is a beginning. You still may have questions about why gender is important. And these questions have been raised in the past, and sometimes in not so kind ways. There were critics of gender and Holocaust studies basically saying it trivializes the experience of the victims by trying to divide the victims into men and women, divide our attention, when really at the end what really matters is that everyone was targeted for death. I think that critical voice has kind of disappeared, at least in the scholarship. It may still be there in the public in general. And today we just want to bring a few aspects of that question to your attention. Whether or not you find it persuasive at the end, we don't know. The four panelists here, we do think there are points that we want to make, and in your questions later, you can ask us what you perhaps found troublesome, what you found persuasive, follow-up questions that you're concerned about. We only have 15 minutes for each person. So it's not that you get a full spectrum of everything that needs to be said, but just a few examples, a few aspects of what we can consider. So let me use just a few, perhaps, examples to explain why there is value to put our attention and our focus on man as a gendered category, man as gendered beings, because so often, as I said before, we assume that we already know. For example, we know for sure that the Holocaust was perpetrated mostly by men. And that is really true for most genocides, not just the Holocaust. But that doesn't lead to the conclusion that therefore most men must be perpetrators. There are different, sometimes we just make the assumptions that when it comes to perpetrator societies that all the men must have been perpetrators, and take away the agency, as we would say in scholarship, meaning the subjective choices that every single man had to take at one point during a genocidal assault. So when and why did men make certain choices? When and why did men join certain units that committed the genocide? Why did some men not do this? What are the differences between young men and old men? Does the profession that they have had before a war or before genocide matter? Were they married? Were they not married? Were they youngsters and free of certain social obligations that influence their decisions? The same obviously can be said about the victims. All men, all Jewish men were targeted for this, but Jewish men had a variety of backgrounds, a variety of issues to struggle with. Perhaps I just mention a few when it comes to Jewish men. Obviously, one of the differences is Jewish men are not Jewish women, but besides that difference, Jewish men kind of covered a wide spectrum of who they were and what was threatened during the process, really a 12-year process, and then more narrowly a 6-year process of being targeted for death. It mattered, for example, if you were an assimilated Jewish man and lived in Germany, and the first losses that you had to deal with and the dishonors that you had to deal with was the loss of your professional life. And since at the time it was more men than women who were professionally active in the 1920s, 1930s, the loss of professional life had a different impact on men than on women. It was a loss of respectability. It was a loss that was felt as a certain kind of humiliation. By the end, we come to the ghettos and the camps. Obviously, the loss of the professional life is less significant than the loss of family members or the loss of basic needs that you no longer are in control of, from being able to wash yourself to being able to feed yourself in the camps and so on and so forth. So when we talk about Jewish men, we also have to look at the different kinds of respectabilities and losses that people felt. It mattered if you were an Orthodox Jewish man, say in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe, and you were targeted for looking a certain way, and you were targeted in a different way than assimilated Jewish men. For example, forcefully cutting off your beards as a Jewish Orthodox man had a different impact on you than if you were an assimilated Jewish man and it wouldn't happen to you and that didn't matter so much to you. So how do we begin to think about these things? How do we have sources where men talk about these things? Do we have any other material and photographs and memoirs that address some of these issues, both in terms of the exterior choices men made, but also the interior experience of man during this time. So much more is there to say. But let me add maybe one or two more examples, and then the examples that Lisa and Robert and Monika will bring will help us to flesh these things out. We know, for example, or it was assumed for a long time in the scholarship, that women in the camps, once they got to the camps, often survived because they were bonding and finding friendships among other women, and that helped them, or some of them, to survive, where the assumption often was that men in the camps were more solitary fighters. They kind of lived and tried to survive by themselves without forming the same social bonds. I think it has become clear by looking more closely at the memoirs and the materials that we have, that this simple distinction just does not hold true. There were probably some men who were solitary fighters, but there were many other men who also survived by bonding to particular people. And it was very important for them to have one or two or three really personal relationships. But they may not have talked about it as much as women because they were not socialized to think that this is important. And this is where we come to the subtitle of our book, The Presence and Absence of Man. On the one hand, the men are present, but they may not just, in their recollections, they may not focus or emphasize certain things about what they experience, whereas women do, because we have been socialized to think of us as individuals and individual survivors, or as more community related survivors. But that doesn't mean that social bonds were not important for men as well. We can talk about dream lives. What did women dream who survived the camps? What did men dream about when they survived the camps? What did women fantasize about when they were living in the camps? We know, for example, some women focused on food through recipes, thinking and sharing recipes, even though you couldn't obviously do anything about it. And when we look at men, recipes is not an issue. Food recipes was certainly not an issue, but what was their issue when they talked about it? How did they talk about starvation, hunger, food deprivation differently? And we want in this volume, and hopefully in future research, to get a better handle on these kind of experiences. So many subjects were not even covered in our book. I will just mention two. One is the issue of shame. How did men experience shame as opposed to women? There is a whole, and then how that relates to trauma. Or another issue, for example, to think about medical procedures done on victims. How were these medical procedures different for men and for women? How did they experience them? How do they talk about them if they survived them? So these are just two other options that we could explore that haven't been explored much yet, and many more. Hopefully today, or by the end of today, you have a better understanding of why this might be an important topic to pursue. And at this point, I will actually hand it over to Lisa Pine, who will be our next panelist to talk about the camps. Lisa, are you with us?
I'm there, I'm here. Thank you very much, Björn. And a pleasure to be on a panel with you again. Last time was in St. Louis, but very delighted and honored to be here, albeit remotely in Cape Town as well. So thank you very much for inviting me. So following on from what Björn said, what I want to talk about is a little bit more about the experiences and the behavior of male Holocaust victims at Auschwitz. So I'm going straight to Auschwitz. And my work in the chapter that I wrote for the book revisits male survivor memoirs through a gendered lens. It allows us to reevaluate and reinterpret them as crucial primary sources, and sheds light on the experiences that pertained to the gendered particularities of men as victims. So it looks at men's words, deeds, and behavior under these extreme conditions, and it also looks at some of the choices that they made in relation to these circumstances. It considers both male behavior that reflected expected gender norms, as Björn already just mentioned, such as egotism, strength, identity through work. So male behavior that really reflected expected norms, but also those that deviated from those expectations. And again, such as food talk and social bonding, which, as Björn just said, was much more associated with women's writing. So there won't be time to discuss all of this now, but through a selection of narratives, what I've done is to explore these specifically gendered aspects of the experiences of male victims in a bit more detail. And I think that revisiting the male testimonies and narratives, so they're not universal, they were before the work on the women's experiences were done, they were sort of held as universal. So now we've looked at women and now we're just looking at men as men. So seeing what's there in their accounts, also considering what might be missing from the historical narrative here too. So how did the male survivors choose to portray their experiences at Auschwitz? Which aspects of their responses to Nazi persecution have they selected to tell? And also maybe what's omitted in there as well. So the expectations about male behavior, expectations about the kinds of norms certainly played a part in this. So which different kinds of masculinity have been omitted from the historical narrative as well? And for example, similarly to the almost entirely absent reference to lesbians in female accounts, is not very much reference at all to homosexuality among male accounts. And partly, of course, that's to do with the fact that it had been a taboo subject for many, many decades. Of course, that's changed now. Also, unexpected conduct or actions that differed from male norms is also harder to detect. So we're kind of trying to look at areas that might have remained outside the historical narrative, things that have been hidden from view or obscured from view. And again, also, while we're on that point, the literature has tended to overlook, both about men and women, but in this case about men, actions, agency, so decisions that people made in order to survive under those appalling conditions in which they found themselves. But of course, that doesn't mean that they didn't occur. So the discussion that I'm making is not to judge, but just to offer a more complete picture of Holocaust experiences and to try and enable and establish a greater understanding of the subject. So I want to talk now about so the point that one of the points that Björn started with about male memoirs. So underplaying bonds, underplaying relationships. And just to give you an example of that, we've got Bruno Bettelheim, survivor, talked about what survival meant to him. And he said survival in the camps depended foremost on luck. While nothing one could do could assure survival, and while the chances for it were extremely slim at best, one could increase them through correctly assessing one's situation and through taking advantage of opportunities. In short, through acting independently and with courage, decision, and conviction, all of which depended on the measure of autonomy one had managed to retain. So we see the beginnings of this norm that counts as I as being very important. Elie Wiesel describes his arrival at Auschwitz and his separation from his mother and sisters. He describes how he walked on with the men, stating that they left behind not only the rest of their families, but also the objects that they had had with them, as well as, he says, their illusions. And his main concern, and again, this is something that's not always discussed, his main concern, he says, was not to lose sight of his father and not to remain alone. And later on too, he repeats, not to be separated from my father was the most important. So these kinds of points are very significant. Like other survivors, he also notes the impact of the arrival rituals. So he says, in a few seconds, we had ceased to be men. Had the situation not been so tragic, we might have laughed. I too had become a different person. And Primo Levi comments too on the aim of the Nazi camps. He says to reduce us to beasts. So there's just the whole rituals at the beginning, and then the whole nature of the conditions once there. But he writes, we must not become beasts. Even in this place, one can survive, and therefore one must want to survive, to tell the story, to bear witness. And his desire to survive was thus underpinned by his resolution and determination to tell his story. And he defended his strength and dignity for this purpose. So I want to come next to have a look at some of the Sonderkommando narratives, so from Sonderkommando survivors. And these, I think, are particularly revealing as expressions of male behavior and choices. So these were the special detachments engaged, I have to say, in the extremely gruesome task of working in the crematoria where the victims' bodies were burned. Now, to date, a lot of the discussion about the Sonderkommando has been concerned with the moral ambivalence of their positions. So they were living in a more privileged circumstance in the camp. They had a chance to survive perhaps longer. At the same time, though, they were carrying out this unenviable and grisly job for their captors. Revisiting their testimonies from the gender perspective sheds light exactly on the particularities of their experiences. Only male prisoners selected for their strength were Sonderkommando. And a number of salient themes emerge from their testimonies. So again, we've talked before about arrival rituals, separation from their families, their attitude to their work, their association with other workers, their relationship to their overseers, their use of cigarettes and alcohol are some of them. So these themes suggest important responses and reactions to their circumstances that were male gendered. And I'll talk briefly now, very briefly, just about a few of them. I'm just going to pick a few. So arrival and separation from the family was a significant theme in these narratives. Miklos Nizhly, the Hungarian Jew who arrived in Auschwitz in April 1944, described his arrival along with a trainload of his compatriots. He says, the male new arrivals jumped out of the rail cars and then turned to take our wives and children in our arms and help them down because the level of the cars was very high. So this represented the normative behavior of the men, the family men, looking after their families. But of course, once the families became separated, as other testimonies have also shown, this was no longer possible. Once they were separated, the men worried about the circumstances of their wives and children, but they were sort of helpless to do anything. Nizhly describes later how after his family's departure, he was at times terribly depressed and filled with loneliness. And this separation obviously meant that the men were powerless to protect their families any longer, not able to carry out their traditional gender role. Work is one of the other topics that crops up as a matter of overriding significance. The importance of their job, the fact that if they continue to be doing something for their captors, a useful job, that they will survive. One of the most crucial aspects I think worth talking about, talked about the ambivalence of their positions, and Nizhly's description of the Sonderkommando as younger men handpicked for their strength and a good physical condition is unsurprising because they were going to need their strength to do that job. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, he notes that they had a general tendency to nervous disorders and the terrible strain that was placed upon them to know that their brothers, wives, parents were perishing here. So a lot of nervous depression and those kinds of symptoms. Shlomo Venezia, another survivor and Sonderkommando member, also describes the difficult, gruesome and uncomfortable nature of their work, and he does so with a lot of candidness. He says, you see, the men in the Sonderkommando were also forced to do that kind of thing. It can't be denied, nor can it be said that it didn't exist or isn't true. And yet in this case, I acknowledge that I feel a bit complicit, even if I didn't kill them. We had no choice. There was no other possibility in that hell. So we come to this concept of choiceless choice, keeping on going day by day, impossible in itself. And yet they were determined to live at any price, very close to death, carrying on day by day with some kind of special strength to get through, but obviously very difficult circumstances that they were facing. One more brief example, and then I'll come to my conclusions. Prayer is a subject that appears, so again, among men's survivors, and here in the Sonderkommando narratives too. So Philip Müller tells of how his foreman divided extra rations into equal parts, and how he prayed with tears in his eyes, stating that man differs from animals in that he believes in God. And Müller writes in response to that, "To me it seemed sheer madness to pray in Auschwitz, absurd to believe in God in this place. But here, on the borderline between life and death, we obediently followed his example because we had nothing else left, or because we felt strengthened by his faith." So there's just a few examples, and I want to just come to a few points of conclusion. So what I've shown here very briefly, and in the chapter in the book in more detail, is that survivor accounts, as both narratives and testimonies, bear witness to the events of the Holocaust as important historical sources, revisited here through the lens of gender, to allow us to see them as the testimonies of men specifically. Additionally, the memoirs of the Sonderkommando allow us to begin to comprehend the ambivalent position of these male victims at Auschwitz who served the machinery of death. So a fresh reading of these accounts allows us to understand perhaps aspects that have not been previously analysed in relation to the gendered experiences of male Holocaust victims. Beyond this, my work has looked at the significance men placed on work as a means of dealing with their situation, trying to gain control of it in a similar way to which women used homemaking skills to do the same, and of surviving. So as I said before, as long as they could perform their tasks, their chance of survival remained. Inability to work almost inevitably signals selection and death. Men also chose to portray in their narratives qualities of strength, courage, autonomy, and independence. As we have seen, once they were separated from their wives and their children, an obvious aspect of their familiar pattern of behavior, their responsibility for their family members, was taken away from them, leaving them feeling bereft and bewildered. Obviously, along with the other extreme circumstances in which they found themselves placed at Auschwitz. So an analysis of gender-based distinctions in Holocaust experiences and the ways that they have been narrated, in this case by men, adds an important angle to our knowledge and understanding of life and death at Auschwitz. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, from London. You joining us from London. What you kind of mentioned implicitly, but not completely explicitly, is the fact that, for example, if you were in the Sonderkommando, only men, you said this, were allowed to be in that position. It also, women were excluded automatically, but it also means that men were put in a position where they had to deal with moral ambiguity. They became complicit in the machinery of death, which became the specific male experience. And then how do men deal with that enforced complicity over which they had no choice? And that brings up then the issues of gender and morality and survival and so on and so forth. Thank you, Lisa, so much. We turn our attention now to a voice from Berlin. Robert Sommer, it is yours now. Are you still there?
Yes, can you see me and hear me overall? Well, thank you very much for the invitation. That's very kind of you. I feel very honored to be part of this panel today. My focus is a bit different. I focus mainly on sexuality in concentration camps. My work, as was said before, is on basically focusing on forced prostitution and sexuality in concentration camps. Before I start talking about this today, I'd like to give you like, it's very important for German scholars in particular to make this differentiation. In the Anglo-Saxon academic world, it's very popular to talk about death camps, camps as concentration camps or extermination camps as kind of one type of camp. In Germany, we'd like to kind of differentiate and say on one side there were camps merely to establish to kill people, which are called the extermination camps, Sobibor, Belgisch, Treblinka. And on the other hand, there were also camps which were considered the concentration camps. Auschwitz, for instance, is the biggest concentration camp in the Nazi system, which also served as an extermination camp. There were other camps like Dachau or Buchenwald, which merely served as camps to imprison people, also to kill people, but the killing wasn't the main importance of these camps. When I visited Auschwitz for the first time years ago, I was on a tour about the female experience and women in concentration camps, and especially in Auschwitz. And we came across a place, which is the barrack number 24 in the Stammlager, in the main camp of Auschwitz. And the lady who gave us a tour talked about a brothel which existed in the camp. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that there is something as a brothel. And for me, that was the beginning of a long research. I wanted to find out about brothels in concentration camps. And so I started writing my master thesis and later on my PhD on the subject of forced prostitution of camp brothels, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. When I did wrote my PhD, I found out that it's very little written about sexuality in general in concentration camps. So how do we understand, how do we see sexual behavior of men and women in the camp? And so I I did research on the subject of male sexuality in the camp, which for us, as we kind of imagine piles of dead bodies, skeleton-like looking people, the so-called Musulman, in the camp, how does sexuality work in that context? A part of my chapter of my dissertation is on sexuality in camps. And so this is the chapter which I contributed, thank Björn, to your book, is on the male experience and the sexual experience in a camp. Well, first of all, when a human being was sent to a camp, first of all, when you talk about Auschwitz, so continue what Lisa was saying, people arrive at the ramp and a big number of people got sent to the gas chambers right away. But the other people who were considered by the Nazis able to work, were sent into the camp to do slave labor. A prisoner, as soon as he entered the camp, went into a stage of shock. And the stage of shock was kind of, people had to break with everything they were ever experienced in life before. Men and women were reduced to numbers. Their heads were shaven, their hair was shaven. They were put into these striped pajamas. And basically, the destruction of the human identity was part of the first initial scenes of the concentration camp. From that moment on, everything changed. There was Viktor Frankl, a survivor of Auschwitz, who actually himself was also a psychologist, who wrote a very important book, and he talks about the psychology of survival in the camps. And he says, after this first shock comes a second phase, which is a phase of adjustment to the camp atmosphere. So people, men and women at the same time, learn how to survive in camps, and kind of little by little kind of build up a way, also a type of an identity to be inside of the camp. Now, this is a phase when sexuality all of a sudden becomes important again in the camp. Most of the prisoners who lost their, identity also lost their sexual identity, as I just explained. But by surviving the camp, meant also like to build up a strong identity, which also meant, and this is what I argue in my chapter, to build up, to re-sexualize yourself, to rehumanize yourself, to build up an identity which is sometimes sexual, or very often it's also sexual. Now, when you focus on men, in concentration camps, we see that sexuality for the total majority of the camp, 80% maybe 90%, depending on the camp, never had any significance. And the reason is very obvious, because we're talking about men who fight for survival. Hunger is the biggest experience they have, and as long as you feel the hunger, there's obviously no sexual drives. But also we have to see that in the camp, there was a kind of a society which was very different. While the majority of the camp prisoners were trying to survive on a daily basis, there was a small stratum, as we call the functionaries, the elite of the prisoners, who were in high positions, capo positions, who were working, for instance, at the kitchen or at the registry, working indoor. Those were the people who kind of managed to survive also to get food, extra food, and the feeling of hunger for those people disappeared a little more. And so sexuality all of a sudden became interesting for them again. You can see also already at that point that as for the majority of the camp prisoners, the male prisoners, sexuality was not important, but for some it was. So it actually is already a marker of your power and inside of the camp. So people with more power had sexual drives all of a sudden again. And they were also able or willing to live out this sexuality. Now, how does it work? Most of the concentration camps were separated. Well, genders were separated. So basically you had a women's camp and a male camp. Most of the camps were male camps. The major camp for women was Ravensbrück. And from 1943 on, the SS also started having female camps, smaller female camps at the male camps. And the reason is because for work, most of the prisoners were working in factories for the war industry. And so they also needed women for some of the works. And so they also had at most of the major concentration camp women's sections. Until this moment, many of the male prisoners did not have any possibility to see women in the camp. And so sexuality kind of was lived out through situational homosexuality. That was probably the most common way to have a sexual relationship in a camp. So what happened is a capo, for instance, would live have a very special position in a camp. He has access to food. He has, they have play card games in the evening, capos among each other. Also, capos sleep separately from the rest of the people. Most of the prisoners in the barrack sleep in bunks, while the capos have a little kind of extra bedroom for themselves. So capos would have often a young boy who was mostly a messenger, but also had to serve for sexual pleasures. So especially young boys were sexually abused. Sometimes these boys accepted the sexual abuse because they found it's the way to survive in the camp. And also we know that the SS knew about this, and they were very severely punishing people who they found had sexual relationships. Though those sexual relationships were widely spread in most of the camp system. So I would say the most spread way to live a sexuality was a so-called people relationship. People is also the title of a book by Kazetnik, who actually wrote, it's a fictional book, but he actually wrote, talks about a boy who accepted being sexually abused by another prisoner just to get bread, and this way he survived. There were also ways for men to live out sexuality in mixed camps. Auschwitz is a very good example. So we have accounts of women and men talking about prisoners who actually male prisoners who managed to come into the women's camp in Auschwitz, and there's a big market for sexual barter. Many of the prisoners would not recognize men or women as sexual beings. There's an interesting account, I forgot the name of the survivor, but he talks about how he saw columns of women passing by while he was working in the fields. And he said he just didn't recognize women anymore. There were no sexual features. Their heads were shaven, and they did not have any kind of desire or any kind of sexual feelings towards the women. What was different though was young women who still had, were visibly female, women who brought to the camp and just stayed there. After a few months, all the secondary sexual features disappear. But in the very beginning, women are still look like women in the camp. So men actually try to have sexual relationships with them. It was possible for some men who were able to travel around the camp, but actually only a few. But those who were able to travel, like for instance, messengers or people of the fire department, for instance, prisoners who work at the fire department, those were the people who had power and also who had access to food. And so women would have sexual relationships with them. There was a name for that, kochanas, which comes from the Polish word of kochami, to love. And women would agree to give sexual favors or in exchange for bread or even protection. So that was one of the few heterosexual situations where heterosexual sexuality played an important role in the camps. But as I was saying before, as most of the camps always had the separation between men and women, most of the sexual relationships were actually situational homosexual. Until the year 1943, when the SS established camp brothels. And now I come back to what I said before. The SS used prisoners of the concentration camps not only just to torture them or for medical experiences, but examinations and experiments, but also most of the prisoners had to work in factories. And in 1943 on, prisoners were very important for the SS because they worked for the war industry. And Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS was running the entire camp system. He had the idea to make them work harder. Well, it's simple. You think, how do you make these starving people work harder? Easy, you give them more food, better shelter, better hygienic conditions. But Heinrich Himmler thought, no, we do something different. And he introduced a system of incentives to prisoners. So a prisoner in a concentration camp was now able to receive certain kind of privileges or certain kind of extras, bonuses, if he worked harder. Now, one of the incentives or one of the things he could buy was a visit to a concentration camp brothel. The first brothel was built at the concentration camp of Mauthausen. Later on, it was 1942, and later on in 43 and 44 and even 45, in 10 of the major camps, these brothels were built. There were 2 in Auschwitz. There's one in in Barrack 24, which actually was, Barrack 24 is what Katzetnik talks in The House of Dolls as the brothel. But in his fictional book, the brothel is a brothel for the, actually women are mostly Jewish inside of there. And the visitors of the brothels were military people like SS men or Wehrmacht soldiers. What is not true, because that brothel existed, only that the visitors were men from the concentration camps, prisoners themselves. And the women actually who were the so-called prostitutes in there, the sexual slave workers, as we say, where none of them are Jewish. Because the reason for that is because people who were allowed to visit a brothel were never Jewish prisoners. Always prisoners who were German prisoners or I don't know, Polish prisoners. But Jewish prisoners were always excluded. So the brothels, to go back to what I started, the brothels were established in 10 of the major camps. And the SS recruited women from Ravensbrück. As we know today, there were about 200 women at all as the total number of victims who were in the brothels. And at the Auschwitz brothels, there were 2. There was one in the main camp and also one in Monowitz. In Auschwitz, there were about more than 65 women actually in both of the brothels. The SS would grant the privilege to some of the prisoners. So if you worked hard enough, you would receive a voucher. And the voucher actually gave you the possibility to visit a brothel. The voucher had a value, so there was usually 1 mark or 2 marks on the voucher. And if you had 2 marks on your account, which the vouchers you put in your account in the camp, you could visit a brothel. Now, the way it worked was very unusual for a brothel, because what happened is, if a prisoner wanted to visit a brothel, a male prisoner, he had to wait for the roll call at night. He had to, his number was called. Usually they had a mixed number of about 20 or 30 people at night, depending on the brothel. And those people actually were, then had to wait and all marched together to the brothel barrack. Inside of the brothel barrack, they had to lower their pants in a medical room. They were examined for sexual transmitted STDs. There was some kind of liquid, or we don't even know what it was, put on their genitals. And then they were left into, well, actually they had to line up in front of a room. The room door was closed and then the room door opened. The prisoner was pushed inside. The door was closed. Inside was a woman waiting. And 15 minutes were given to the male prisoners to have their sexual intercourse. There was a spy hole in the door, and through the spy hole, an SS guard watched the prisoner. There were certain rules, like no talking, no shoes on the bed, only the missionary position was allowed. And so when the 15 minutes were over, the door opened and the SS man dragged the person outside, and they had to march back to their barracks. You can see that this is a very typical SS way, typical Nazi way of dealing with sexuality. It was a gratification, it was a privilege granted to some of the prisoners, but it was nothing really, let's say, emotional or nothing sensational about it. It was a pure bureaucratic act of a sexual intercourse, which was violent, obviously. Now, the people who visited the camp brothels were always, and I did calculations in my PhD thesis.
Robert, can we, a minute or so left? Okay,
thank you. So the prisoners actually was a very small number. About less than 1% of the prisoners were actually able to go to the camp brothels. This brings us back to the point where people, the sexuality in the camp was very unimportant for most of the prisoners, but very important for some of the other prisoners. Now, prisoners actually, and now I come to my conclusions, prisoners who were actually able to re-sexualize themselves in different ways also use this to understand themselves as a human being. So people actually visited the camp brothels sometimes not because they wanted to have a sexual intercourse, but because they actually wanted to talk to women, also see a woman, and have it something as a feeling of being a human being again. So sexuality in the camp is on one hand side connected to trying to be a human being again. Sexuality on the other side was also a marker of power and very violent very often. And sexuality also was a way, I would say, an attempt of prisoners to survive the camp, and therefore a kind of a method of resistance, because gaining a sexual identity was also trying to be human again. And this is actually what the SS always wanted to avoid. And this is also what the prisoners wanted to do. And so that's why I would even call it an act of resistance to the machinery of death of the Nazis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert, so much. Before we move to Monika and give her time, can you answer very quickly a term that we kind of threw in without explaining, and that is the term situational homosexuality, that many people may not be familiar with that?
Yeah, sorry, I should have said this before. Situational homosexuality is something which is common in prisons. We know this, male prisoners who actually are heterosexual do have a homosexual relationship inside of a camp. But as soon as they get out, well, inside of a prison or later on the camp, but as soon as they get out of the camp, they have a heterosexual relationships again. So it's because of the absence of the other gender. It's the human being decides or thinks it's I could have a sexual relationship to someone who looks feminine, and that's why it's not what we consider not a real homosexual relationship, but something which is because of the situation.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you, Robert. We now give Monika our attention. Monika is speaking to us from Pennsylvania. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank everybody at the Holocaust and Genocide Center in Cape Town, primarily, for organizing this very exciting webinar. I also want to thank Björn here publicly for bringing us all contributors together for this very innovating volume on masculinities. I direct a Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Graz College. Let me get my slides up here. and Holocaust genocide studies at Graz College, which is the first independent Jewish institution of higher learning in North America. We were the first to create a master's in Holocaust and genocide studies online. We also, 3 years ago, created the very first doctoral program in Holocaust and genocide studies. I invite you all to please check our website at graz.edu. Let me look into my, get my screen right here. Just a second. I'm sorry, I will have to show it this way, Björn. So sorry, from this side, okay? First, I want to make a trigger warning. The whole panel, obviously, on the Holocaust is quite disturbing. The material I'm going to deal with and present some quotations are particularly disturbing. I just want to make this up front. The chapter I contributed to deals with Polish Jewish doctors in occupied Poland. I was interested in how male physicians describe the reality around them in contrast to female physicians, and what this distinction can tell us about how men in general they process certain moral issues that were raised by the Holocaust. So why doctors? Well, doctors are carriers of a very special ethos of a healer. They are trusted with their most intimate secrets. They are endowed with a highly specialized knowledge. And additionally, in the ghettos, doctors I investigated were all working in the ghettos in occupied Poland. Also knew frequently ahead of time about the upcoming deportations. They understood better than the rest of the population what certain Nazi ordinances meant for the population. And what's most grievous in this context, they were placed in a very ambiguous moral role. On the one hand, they were to provide medical care for the ghetto population. On the other, they were also enrolled in aid to participate in selections of people meant for deportations to death camps. So in some sense, they were involved in making life and death decisions that ultimately the Nazis were responsible for. To understand how males' autobiographical writings presented the reality in the ghettos, we need to look at two things. First, we need to look and consult literary studies and see how literary studies define male and female autobiographical writings. Secondly, we cannot just study the men, we need to study women. So according to the dictum that a man is what a woman is not, and vice versa, we need to see how female physicians describe similar experiences in the ghettos. So moving here further, this is to some degree a simplification, of course, for the purpose of this short presentation. But in general, in male autobiographies, the identity of a male is built around overcoming personal obstacles. Through overcoming of those obstacles, self emerges as this victorious hero. Secondly, in men's autobiographies, there is a strong connectedness to the society and to the historical events that take place. They concentrate on chronicling progress of their professional intellectual lives. Thirdly, they generally create the impression of a coherent and logically developed whole. So as a mirror image, and in contrast to that, female autobiographies are based on building identity in relation to some autonomous being. It can be a child, husband, friend, God, or even a collectivity. Secondly, they rarely mirror the established history of their times. Even autobiographies of the most accomplished women usually usually concentrate on their private personal lives rather than outside achievements. Thirdly, their narratives are usually presented not in chronological order and appear to be rather irregular and lack ordinariness that is typical for male autobiographies. And my research to a large extent confirms that division that is observed in literary studies. Here, I would like to focus on examples that deal with how male and female physicians approach certain difficult moral choices in the ghetto. So to illustrate that, I'll present a passage contained in narratives of a married couple who went through the same events. I was really lucky to find 4 ego documents that belong to 2 married couples. At the time they were not married, but they were already fiancés, and they were engaged, and they lived in the same place. They experienced almost the same events. They shared, obviously, impressions with each other. They shared judgments. So to some degrees, when you look at their narratives, it's almost like a lab situation. We have the only distinction that appears between their narratives is gender. So this was extremely valuable for me to look at those 4 documents. Here I will focus on a passage from the 2 documents by Dr. Alina Margolis-Edelman and Dr. Mark Edelman, the famous leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This passage refers to an extremely disturbing phenomenon of infanticide during the Great Deportation in the Warsaw Ghetto in July 1942. So Alina Margolis describes the event that she witnessed in the following way. I ran up to the first floor. In the depths of the room, among empty beds, a young woman was in labor. Without a word, without a cry. Next to the bed stood a girl in a pink dress of the student of the nursing school, my friend from an older group. Next to her, a doctor. I knew him, he lived in our house. I stopped, I secretly came closer. They didn't notice me. After a moment, I heard a sharp cry. In doctor's large hands, a newborn, covered in mucus, was straightening up his head. He cried. I saw everything as if in a sharp light. I saw a questioning look of the doctor directed to the mother. I saw how, with barely visible gesture, she nodded her head. I saw a second look thrown to the pink dress of the nurse. And immediately after that, her move. She grabbed a pillow from the next bed and pressed it on the newborn. The cry was barely audible now. The action was over. From afar, one could still hear some shots, end quote. So this narrative from Alina's memoir seems to be concerned primarily with the very act of an innocent life meeting its end among this surrounding catastrophe and destruction. She perceives the silent communication between the mother, the nurse, and the doctor, and allows us to approximate the agonies that each of them is experiencing at this moment. He notices the mother who, with barely visible nod, permits this new life that just left her womb to be suffocated. The closing of the narrative also has a kind of double meaning. Alina talks about action being over. It's action, obviously, of the Nazis finishing for the day, but it's also the action of the Jewish mother killing her own child in this most inhuman time. This text, if you look at it also in a obviously larger context, which I cannot describe here in greater details, invites an open-ended reflection on the nature of morality in times of unprecedented terror. It poses certain questions, but it does not provide any definite conclusions. Now, compare this with Dr. Mark Edelman's accounts of probably the same event, which he did not witness, which he heard about from Alina, most probably. Quote, when the liquidation action started and they were gathering up people from the first floor of our hospital, one woman upstairs was in labor. A doctor and a nurse were with her. And when the baby was born, the doctor handed it to the nurse, and the nurse laid it on a pillow and smothered it with another one. The baby whimpered for a while and then grew silent. This woman was 19 years old. The doctor didn't say a thing to her, not a word. And this woman knew herself what she was supposed to do, end quote. So in this narrative, which was part of conversation with the journalist, the story is very short, concise. The point is that the nurse who smothered the child knew herself what she was supposed to do. And as in other instances in Marek's work, the moral is that the morality itself seems to have been suspended during this time of horror. He depicts absurd times to which traditional morality does not seem to apply. Similar tendency to focus on a logic, where the logic may lead us, the logic of different moral choices during the Holocaust, can be observed in an extraordinary document written by Dr. Arnold Mostowicz, who spent the war years in the Łódź ghetto. He is the author of short autobiographical stories written in third person. In one of them, a doctor, possibly Mostowicz himself, is ordered to examine and select candidates for approximate deportation. This doctor belongs to an underground organization, and one of his tasks is to save certain people who may be valuable to resistance. He's supposed to give them good reports so they will stay in the ghetto a little longer and will be useful for the resistance. Mostowicz justifies his own presence at this post by claiming that, quote, regardless of whether he was there or not, in any event, 800 people were destined for death in the tracks, end quote. In this account, the narrator comes to be confronted by the potential deportee, a certain Albert Cohen, who is a middle-aged former philosopher from Prague. He was deported first from Prague to the Łódź ghetto, who now in the Łódź ghetto works as a garbage man. The doctor offers him a good report so that he could stay a little longer in the ghetto, but Cohen challenges the doctor with certain moral questions. He reminds the doctor that there is a deportation quota, and if he is spared, someone else would have to be found in his place. He accuses then the doctor of becoming like God, deciding who should live and who should die. The doctor defends himself with arguments that we know from post-war debates on the Jewish consuls. He brings the utilitarian argument that it is worthy to save the fittest or those who may be most valuable for the underground. And he also brings the proportionalist argument that it is worthy to kill a few to save many more. Well, Cohen rejects all this logic, and at the end of the story, he enunciates his credo, which here I quote. You will be shocked by it, but I'm completely indifferent to that. Perhaps this is the most important difference between us. You divide people according to some criteria. You are giving them grades. As far as I'm concerned, nothing would free me from the burden of knowing that someone was sent to death instead of me. The garbage man, Albert Cohen from the ghetto, and the capable philosopher, Albert Cohen from Prague, are equally undeserving that someone should die for them, end quote. In this final declaration, Cohen stands up for inviolable human dignity of each human person that no one has the right to ignore or take away. So coming now to conclusions, I must say that the Holocaust obviously provides major moral challenges for both men and women, but it is the male physicians who seem to be able to acknowledge and articulate them most sharply. While female doctors focus more on personal cost and agonies accompanying making controversial moral decisions, the male doctors seem to point to the logical conclusions that unavoidably ensue from making such choices. their perspective is more on a moral principle being challenged. My findings, therefore, to some degree confirm what is known about gender perspective in autobiographical writings, but they also add to it by acknowledging a male tendency to create a principle-focused narrative in a situation of extreme violence during the Holocaust. Thank you.